In early 1900, Vladimir Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, embarked on his long journey back to Russia. The moonlight enabled him to travel on a horse at night. He settled in Pskov in northwestern Russia, as he was only allowed to stay in provinces. Stubborn as he was to advance the socialist movement, he still traveled to Moscow and St. Petersburg until he got arrested again and landed in jail for 10 days. The plan he cooked up in exile was to push the Russian Marxist movement toward a more serious way of functioning. After the crashing of the First Congress of the Russian Marxist Party, the socialist collectives fell back to separation and isolation. Some of these collectives became associated with the quote-unquote anti-dogmatic, moderate line pushed in the newspaper Рабочее дело, workers' cause, a key target of Lenin's What is to be done 2 years later. Lenin understood that before a physical organization can be built, there must be solid ideological and political unity, especially because there was a dangerous way of thinking taking over more and more Marxist circles at the time. This danger, which has re-emerged across today's fragmented left, required an immediate and decisive response, touching on the crucial questions surrounding tactics, strategy, and propaganda, issues that have regained critical urgency today. Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. Otherwise, our unity will be purely fictitious. It will conceal the prevailing confusion and hinder its radical elimination. At the turn of the century, the Marxist movement in Russia was fragmented into many smaller circles. This fragmentation, however, cannot be explained just by police repression or technical obstacles. Much like today, it was above all a reflection of deeper ideological and political confusion, particularly a lack of clarity on fundamental theoretical and strategic questions on how to apply revolutionary Marxism to the concrete conditions of the time. In exile, Lenin developed an idea as the first step to solve this problem: a newspaper. It is time to come out on the road of open advocacy of socialism, on the road of open political struggle. The establishment of an all-Russian organ of social democracy must be the first step on this road. Lenin in particular saw great danger in the economists who wanted to restrict the movement to workplace grievances. But, Lenin argued, if you want a serious movement, you can't just agree on anti-capitalism and only talk about strikes and higher wages. You need to talk about everything: politics, theory, international events, how the party should be organized, all of it. Every serious worker and organizer should have clear views on these big questions. Otherwise, you can't build a real revolutionary movement. Lenin saw the economist tendency as the Russian expression of a broader and dangerous international trend, one that sought to revise Marxism in a more liberal direction. In the last episode, we talked more about the root causes of economism. The economists, which rallied around the Рабочее дело publication, argued for focusing on concrete practice of the movement while belittling big political questions. They thus conceded the field of politics to the bourgeoisie, much like anarchism, which he wrote on in the same year. He's also pushing back against the economists' idea that workers should only get simple content while theory is left to intellectuals. You have to combine both, he said. You take real struggles and explain them using the underlying, deeper connections in society, so people actually understand what's going on behind the surface. The whole point of this publication should serve a larger goal: the building of one unified national organization. Uniting the Marxists is not simply a technical question. The political questions and discussions on concrete events should permeate everything if you want to have solid unity and not be isolated. Quote, "Here the question naturally arises. If the proposed publications are to serve the purpose of uniting all Russian Social Democrats and mustering them into a single party, how can we combine the varying points of view with the maintenance of a uniform editorial policy for these publications? Should these publications be merely a jumble of various views, or should they have an independent and quite definite tendency? We hold to the second view." Lenin doesn't want this organ of the future party to reflect the state of confusion in the Russian left, but to push a consistent Marxist line while allowing for discussions. In April of 1900, a group of the who's who of Russian Marxism gathered in Pskov to approve Lenin's draft statement, and Iskra was born, the spark that ignites the flame of revolution. However, many of the most important Marxists were living in exile. To get them on board and to escape constant police surveillance, Lenin once again goes into exile to realize his plan. Lenin's first destination was once again Switzerland. This is also where many leading Marxists in exile had gathered. In late August, he traveled from Zurich to French-speaking Geneva. Lenin, now 30 years old, was determined to meet the 15 years older Georgy Plekhanov, the foremost ideologist of Russian Marxism at the time, and, along Lenin, a fierce critic of economism. Securing his support was crucial. Lenin had already visited him. However, this time there was something foul with his intellectual mentor, who was wrought up, very suspicious and self-righteous. My infatuation with Plekhanov disappeared as if by magic, and I felt offended and embittered to an unbelievable degree. Never in my life had I regarded any other man with such sincere respect and veneration. Never had I stood before any man so humbly, and never before had I been so brutally kicked. When Plekhanov didn't get his way, he even boycotted the project, but still managed to secure extra influence on the Iskra editorial board. Possibly Plekhanov now felt threatened by these younger, ambitious radicals who pushed for big moves and feared of losing control. Although a compromise was reached for the moment, Lenin continued to admire Plekhanov. But within a few years, Plekhanov would become one of Lenin's main political opponents. It was agreed to launch the paper from Munich in Germany, where Lenin moved to in September. Escaping police surveillance was not so easy, however. Even in exile, he would use 150 pseudonyms and false passports to keep a low profile. Meanwhile, his wife, Nadia Krupskaya, also finished her sentence in exile and immediately tries to find her undercover husband without smartphones and the internet in the year 1901. She later tells this comedy spy movie story about trying to find him. She's convinced she was writing to him in Prague. Turns out her letters have actually been forwarded to some guy in Munich named Rittermeier. So she goes there, convinced Lenin is living under that name, only to be greeted by a random, chubby innkeeper who is Rittermeier, which to her obviously didn't look like Lenin. Luckily, the innkeeper's wife steps in and leads her to the back, where Lenin is actually hiding under yet another name, Meyer. When she finally finds him, he's living super simply in a tiny, barely furnished room, basically surviving on porridge and tea from a single tin cup, which he washes and hangs up like it's his most prized possession. The revolutionary couple is finally united, and Nadia becomes once again Lenin's collaborator. By then, Iskra had become the political center of Lenin's efforts to push the Marxist line in order to advance the movement. In its first issue, Lenin published the urgent tasks of our movement. Quote, "We must train people who will devote the whole of their lives, not only their spare evenings, to the revolution. We must build up an organization large enough to permit the introduction of a strict division of labor in the various forms of our work. Finally, with regard to question of tactics, we shall confine ourselves to the following. Social democracy does not tie its hands. It does not restrict its activities to some one preconceived plan or method of political struggle. It recognizes all methods of struggle, provided they correspond to the forces at the disposal of the party and facilitate the achievement of the best results possible under the given conditions. If we have a strongly organized party, a revolt in a single locality may grow into a victorious revolution. We must bear in mind that the struggles with the government for partial demands and the gain of certain concessions are merely light skirmishes with the enemy, encounters between outposts, whereas the decisive battle is still to come. Before us, in all its strength, towers the enemy fortress, which is raining shot and shell upon us, mowing down our best fighters. We must capture this fortress, and we will capture it if we unite all the forces of the awakening proletariat." Iskra was smuggled into Russia, becoming the country's most successful underground newspaper in decades. And, for the first time, In December 1901, Vladimir Ulyanov finally adopted the famous name, possibly inspired by the Siberian Lena River. Lenin had finally become Lenin. Among his most important articles in that year, Where to Begin. In recent years, the question of what is to be done has confronted Russian Social Democrats with particular insistence. It is not a question of what path we must choose, but of what practical steps we must take upon the known path and how they shall be taken. Lenin is saying that the Marxists are past the stage of debating what they believe in. They already chose the path of Marxism and revolution. The real problem now is what are we actually doing about it. He's going off on the Рабочее дело people, saying they just chase whatever trend is hot at the moment. For a long time, they espoused moderate economism. The next day, they're suddenly super radical, quoting Karl Liebknecht, talking about storming the autocracy and ceaseless calls of street protests. Lenin's point was that this isn't real strategy, it's just flip-flopping, basically copying whatever sounds exciting. During those years, Russia saw a wave of quickly radicalizing student protests and strikes against the autocracy, who used brutal repression in dispersing them. Lenin goes on in saying that the economist leftists in Russia are suddenly acting as if militancy is this brand new strategy no one ever talked about. The tailists now suddenly turn commandist by calling for isolated acts of terror. For Lenin, that's a huge problem, because instead of building a strong, coordinated movement, these calls actually weaken the movement from the inside and draw the most committed revolutionaries away from the real work. He's basically arguing, you don't just launch dramatic attacks when you don't even have an army. The priority should be to build a serious, disciplined organization that can unite people and be ready when the moment for real, decisive confrontations actually comes. He says nobody in their right mind would see it the other way around. But Рабочее дело apparently thinks we can. At any rate, it exclaims, form assault columns. But this again is more zeal than reason. He goes on to explain that anyone who is actually serious about revolution and not posturing can see that at the present moment our slogan cannot be to the assault, but has to be lay siege to the enemy fortress. In other words, the immediate task of our party is not to summon all available forces for the attack right now, but to call for the formation of a revolutionary organization capable of uniting all forces and guiding the movement in actual practice, and not in name alone. That is, an organization ready at any moment to support every protest and every outbreak and use it to build up and consolidate the fighting forces suitable for the decisive struggle. The core problem Lenin identifies in Рабочее дело is not just that it holds wrong positions, but that it lacks stable principles altogether. The root issue, he says, is unprincipled opportunism. Remember in the last episode, we said how left and right opportunism are two sides of the same coin, and that people often move from one to the other. His fundamental accusation is that they practice eclecticism, which is the unprincipled mixing of ideas from different theories without a clear, consistent framework. Not having a consistent theoretical foundation means that you are not able to distinguish between short-term tactics, which can change quickly, and long-term strategy, which does not change as quickly. An organization without unity in theory and strategy leads to factionalism or bureaucratic control. Without unity in theory and ideology, whatever works right now becomes the politics. Radical language emerges without direction, the organization gets lost in activism, short-term tactics replace strategy, and instead of fighting bad ideas, the group organizes them. This is why the working class movement must build a strong, centralized political organization and conduct consistent agitation around solid unity. In peaceful circumstances, the economists refuse to move toward the party, and during times of storm, all of a sudden, they vaguely posture about storming the fortress. However, it is ridiculous to plat different circumstances and the change of periods. The building of a fighting organization and the conduct of political agitation are essential under any drab, peaceful circumstances, in any period, no matter how marked by a declining revolutionary spirit. Moreover, it is precisely in such periods and under such circumstances that work of this kind is particularly necessary, since it is too late to form the organization in times of explosion and outbursts, The party must be in a state of readiness to launch activity at a moment's notice, change the tactics within 24 hours, but in order to change tactics, it is first necessary to have tactics. Without a strong organization skilled in waging political struggle under all circumstances and at all times, there can be no question of that systematic plan of action, illumined by firm principles and steadfastly carried out, which alone is worthy of the name tactics. Simply put, you can't change tactics if you don't have an organization grounded in principles. We should not only be clear on the nature of the organization that is needed and its precise purpose, but we must elaborate a definite plan for an organization, so that its formation may be undertaken from all aspects. In view of the pressing importance of the question, we, on our part, take the liberty of submitting to the comrades a skeleton plan to be developed in greater detail in a pamphlet now in preparation for print. The pamphlet in question is one of Lenin's most famous works, What is to be Done, which we'll talk about soon. Due to the quickly growing socialist movement, and since the class struggle also occurs on the ideological propaganda level, Lenin's idea is that the centralized political newspaper would be the first step in laying siege to the enemy fortress. It would help fix the low theoretical level of the movement by spreading ideas consistently, educating people, exposing the connections between the various problems and the government, and, most importantly, striving toward ideological and strategic clarity. So for Lenin, the newspaper isn't just about information, it's like the backbone of the movement which strives to establish a party. Like the scaffolding around a building under construction, it helps build the organization itself. So, instead of waiting for some spontaneous uprising to happen, Lenin is saying we need to deliberately build the machine that can handle it. And the first step in building that machine is a unified, all-Russian political press. At the same time, this publication would link all the isolated activists into one coordinated network, turning them into organizers and politically conscious propagandists at the same time. In this way, collectively organized propaganda fuses the communist line on the one hand with real-world practical tasks, and on the other hand with the broader masses. What does all of this mean for today in the modern media landscape? We'll talk about this in the next part, where these ideas are systematized in what is to be done. So, to conclude, Lenin does not hate the spontaneity of the masses, as many liberal or even leftist authors claim. He merely despises those who opportunistically make spontaneity into a strategy and refuse to do the hard work of providing leadership. The goal is to consciously work towards being as prepared as possible instead of leaving the revolution to chance. In conclusion, a few words to avoid possible misunderstanding. We have spoken continuously of systematic, planned preparation, yet it is by no means our intention to imply that the autocracy can be overthrown only by a regular siege or by organized assault. Such a view would be absurd and doctrinaire. On the contrary, it is quite possible and historically much more probable that the autocracy will collapse under the impact of one of the spontaneous outbursts or unforeseen political complications which constantly threaten it from all sides. But no political party that wishes to avoid adventurous gambles can base its activities on the anticipation of such outbursts and complications. We must go our own way, and we must steadfastly carry on our regular work. And the less our reliance on the unexpected, the less the chance of our being caught unawares by any historic turns. Throughout this series, we will see how these strategic principles play out in the concrete history of the Russian Revolution. Iskra became more and more popular. From Munich, Lenin, with the help of Nadia, was riding like a machine, building up his international network and visiting the opera and various European cities in his spare time. But he was by no means beyond the reach of the secret police and the ideas of the economists. After a year of publishing, Iskra received a critical letter from an anonymous group of readers, which Iskra published and to which Lenin replied. The critics say that, quote, "The principal drawback of the paper, which is the cause of all of its other defects, large and small, is the exaggerated importance it attaches to the influence which the ideologists of the movement exert upon its various tendencies. At the same time, Iskra gives too little consideration to the material environment of the movement, whose interaction creates a definite type of labor movement and determines its path. The path from which the ideologists, despite all their efforts, are incapable of diverting it, even if they are inspired by the finest theories and programs. The letter goes on. It has set itself the task of fanning the spark into a great conflagration, but it forgets that necessary inflammable material and favorable environmental conditions are required for such a task. In dissociating itself completely from the economists, Iskra loses sight of the fact that their activity prepared the ground for the workers' participation in the February and March events, upon which Iskra lays so much stress and, to all appearances, greatly exaggerates. The critics say Iskra overestimates the power of ideology and ignores the fact that real movements come from material conditions, and that the people it criticizes actually helped create the conditions it now benefits from. They go on. While criticizing adversely the activity of the Social Democrats of the late 90s, Iskra ignores the fact that at the time the conditions were lacking for any work other than the struggle for minor demands, and ignores also the enormous educational significance of that struggle. Iskra is entirely wrong and unhistorical in its appraisement of that period and of the direction of the activities of the Russian Social Democrats at the time, in failing to differentiate between the struggle for minor demands, which widens and deepens the labor movement, and minor concessions, whose purpose was to paralyze every struggle and every movement. Thoroughly imbued with the sectarian intolerance so characteristic of ideologists in the infantile period of social movements, Iskra is ready to brand every disagreement with it, not only as a departure from social democratic principles, but as desertion to the camp of the enemy. We have in mind Iskra's attitude towards Рабочее дело. The critics say Iskra is acting super-sectarian, treating anyone who disagrees with it not just as wrong, but as basically betraying the cause. Iskra is way too mean and obsessed with ideological arguments that don't actually matter much on the ground. These fights just create unnecessary division and even hurt the movement. Iskra also supposedly mixes things up by not seeing the difference between fighting for small gains, which strengthens workers, and accepting small concessions, which weakens them. Iskra's excessive predilection for controversy is due primarily to its exaggerating the role of ideology in the movement, and is partly an echo of the internecine squabbles that have flared up among Russian political exiles in Western Europe, of which they have hastened to inform the world in a number of polemical pamphlets and articles. In our opinion, these disagreements exercise almost no influence upon the actual course of the Russian social democratic movement, except perhaps to damage it by bringing an undesirable schism into the midst of the comrades working in Russia. For this reason, we cannot but express our disapproval of Iskra's fervent polemics, particularly when it oversteps the bounds of decency. A group of comrades, September 1901. Lenin replies. In the first place, we should like to say that we cordially welcome the straightforwardness and frankness of the authors of this letter. It is high time to stop playing at hide-and-seek, concealing one's economist credo, or declaring, as if in mockery of truth, that at the present time not a single social democratic organization is guilty of the sin of economism. And now to the matter. Lenin is explaining that these authors are confused because they don't get that real leaders should guide and stay ahead of spontaneous movements, not just follow what's already happening. To say, however, that ideologists, i.e. politically conscious leaders, cannot divert the movement from the path determined by the interaction of environment and elements is to ignore the simple truth that the conscious element participates in this interaction and in the determination of the path. History shows that if socialists don't intervene, other forces will step in and shape the movement instead. Instead of acknowledging this lack of leadership skills, the revisionists make this lack into a virtue, as something to be proud of. The theoretical views of the authors of this letter, like those of Рабочее дело, do not represent Marxism, but that parody of which is nursed by our critics and Bernsteinians, who are unable to connect spontaneous evolution with conscious revolutionary activity. In the prevailing circumstances of today, this profound theoretical error inevitably leads to a great tactical error, which has brought incalculable damage to Russian social democracy. The material elements of the movement have grown enormously even as compared with 1898, but the conscious leaders, the Social Democrats, lag behind this growth. This is the main cause of the crisis which Russian social democracy is now experiencing. The mass spontaneous movement lacks ideologists sufficiently trained theoretically to be proof against all vacillations. It lacks leaders with such a broad political outlook, such revolutionary energy, and such organizational talent as to create a militant political party on the basis of the new movement. All this in itself would, however, be but half the evil. Theoretical knowledge, political experience, and organizing ability are things that can be acquired, if only the desire exists to study and acquire these qualities. But since the age of 1897, there have come forward in the Russian social democratic movement individuals and periodicals that not only close their eyes to this drawback, but that have declared it to be a special virtue, that have elevated the worship of and servility towards spontaneity to the dignity of a theory, and are preaching that social democrats must not march ahead of the movement, but should drag along at the tail end. The economists' tactics as process approach made them act slowly and waver in everything. From their new amazement with terror, they were now against it when it fell out of fashion. With regards to organization, they say that now the masses are active, we don't need tight organization anymore. And Lenin counters by saying the bigger and more spontaneous a movement becomes, the more, not less, it needs strong, centralized organization. He says we're not even properly organized yet, so all this talk about don't overemphasize ideology or leadership is actually harmful. Staying passive or narrowly focused means surrender of the leadership to bourgeois democracy. And that's exactly what he says already happened. On the idea that leftist infighting only serves to split the movement, Lenin quotes a letter from German social democrat Lassalle to Karl Marx. Writing to Marx, Lassalle said, "The publication of your work against the big men, Kinkel, Ruge, etc., should hardly meet with any difficulties on the part of the police. For in my opinion, the government is not averse to the publication of such works, because it thinks that the revolutionaries will cut one another's throats. Their bureaucratic logic neither suspects nor fears the fact that it is precisely internal party struggles that lend a party strength and vitality, that the greatest proof of a party's weakness is its diffuseness and the blurring of clear demarcations, and that a party becomes stronger by purging itself." Vladimir Lenin concludes by saying that these remarks were only a summary and that Iskra is developing a more complete analysis of these questions, which will appear very soon. In the following year, in order to evade the German police, Lenin and Iskra moved to London, where he'll finish what would become one of the most central works in Marxist history. In the next video, we're diving into What is to be done, a work that fundamentally shaped how revolutionaries think about strategy, organization, and how to make revolution.